Hello everybody. Thank you for joining us for this week's Object Talk. My name is Emma and I am the Engagement Officer at the Jewish Museum, London. Today you are joining us on Holocaust Memorial Day. Since 2001, the 27th of January has been a time to remember the millions murdered during the Holocaust and also in later genocides. Today our Object Talk will be led by our intern Mona, who has chosen an object made by a Holocaust survivor and donated by him to our museum. Mona has been at the Jewish Museum since September, and in that time has been working behind the scenes, creating content for our weekly activity packs, researching objects in our collection, and writing blog posts. Thank you so much for delivering this week's talk, Mona. I will now hand over to you to introduce us to the object you have chosen.
Thank you, Emma, for that lovely introduction, and welcome everybody. Thank you all for joining. On the 27th January 1945, the concentration camp Auschwitz-Birkenau was liberated. Today, the 27th January, is the date on which we shall remember the 6 million Jewish people and millions of others who were murdered under Nazi persecution. Moreover, we shall remember the victims of other genocides. Hatred, prejudices, and violence are not just elements of the past which led to one of the most horrible crimes in the history of humankind. We have to oppose hatred and challenge prejudices over and over again to prevent that something like this can happen again. It is a task which we have to conduct each and every day. The object I want to talk to you about was made by someone who was one of the first survivors to bear witness about the horrors he had to go through. Ian Greenman promised himself to talk about his experiences and dedicated his life to public Holocaust education, talking to inter alia students and visitors at the Jewish Museum. Let's have a closer look at the object I have chosen to present to you today. Ian created the shown model when he was in hospital suffering from depression. The model shows the upper body of an Auschwitz prisoner leaning on a small brick wall, and the loose bricks suggest that he is probably working on that wall. Work in the camps differed depending on which camp the prisoner was in, but heavy physical work, such as construction, was common in almost every camp. The model is wearing the typical blue-white striped uniform of prisoners. Upon arrival, they were stripped of their own civilian clothing and were forced to wear a uniform. The belongings of the deported were sorted and either used within the camp or sold in Germany. Men were given a cap, trousers, and a jacket, whereas women got a dress or a skirt, a jacket, and a kerchief for the head. On their feet they wore wooden, sometimes leather clogs without socks. That led to injuries on their feet like blisters or open sores, which often became infected due to the unhygienic conditions in the camps. Ian's toe was infected as well. Every prisoner got one set of clothing, and they were able to change their clothes just every 6 to 8 weeks. Prisoners did not have soap, free access to clean water, neither the time nor energy to wash their clothing. However, the SS was really keen of them to look tidy. Losing a button or a part of the uniform was punished. Sometimes they were even declared no longer fit to work and sent to the gas chambers. In winter, the uniform's material was a little bit thicker, and some prisoners were lucky enough to receive a sweater or coat. Still, this was inadequate protection from the cold. Ian was transferred to Auschwitz III, where the inmates had to work for the company IG Farben. They also got in touch with toxic materials, but protective clothing was just given on rare instances. That emphasizes the cruel living and working conditions of the ones held captive in the concentration camps. We can see a small red inverted triangle on the left of the model's chest. That stands for the marking system which was in place. It helped the SS to distinguish between the prisoners and enabled them to identify the alleged reasons for their incarceration. The inverted triangles had different colors. Political prisoners wore a red triangle, homosexuals a pink one, Jehovah's Witnesses a purple one, and the one for criminals was green. And asocials were marked with a black one. The Nazis considered, among others, vagrants, nonconformists, and Roma as asocials. However, in some camps, Roma wore a brown triangle. Jewish people were tagged with 2 overlapping yellow triangles, which formed a star. If the prisoner was, for example, a Jewish political prisoner, one of the triangles would be red. Something that is missing on the model, but was part of every prisoner's uniform, is the number which identified them. Each prisoner was given a number, which then served as the identification. The number replaced their name, which was another measure to rob people of their identity and humanity. The prisoners became a number in an ingenious system which murdered people as cold and effectively as possible. In Auschwitz, the number was also tattooed on the prisoner's arm so that corpses could still be identified. Here we can see Leon's arm with his number. He was number 98288. The gaze of the model seems to be empty, as if there is no hope left. I do not want to imagine what Leon was feeling and thinking when he created that model. Leon himself was imprisoned in Auschwitz, and his son and wife were murdered there. He was born in London in 1910 as one of 6 children. After the early death of his mother, the family moved to Rotterdam, where Leon's paternal grandparents lived. Leon left school at the age of 16 and became a hairdresser. He even owned his own hairdresser salon in East London by the age of 21. Back in London, he met Esther van Dam, who he married in 1935. This is a wedding picture of them, which was taken by the well-known wedding photographer Boris Bennett. The newlyweds settled in Rotterdam, and Leon joined his father-in-law's book-selling business. In 1940, their son Barnett, who was also called Barney, was born. This picture shows Barney when he was 2 years old. Shortly after that happy event, the neutral Netherlands were occupied by the Nazis and they became subject to German law. 3/4 of the Dutch Jewish community were murdered during the Second World War, one of the largest number of Jewish victims in Western Europe. The family Greenman gave their most precious things to non-Jewish friends, including their British passports. At some point, the friends became too scared of having Jewish things at their house, so that they burned the passports. This decision was fatal for Leon and his family. This picture shows the Greenmans in June 1942, shortly before their life was about to change drastically. One night in October 1942, they were arrested, although they were British citizens. They tried to convince the officers repeatedly, but it was pointless. Eventually, they were taken to the transit camp Westerbork in North Holland, where they stayed for a few months. In January 1943, they were deported to the concentration camp Auschwitz-Birkenau. Leon was separated from his family and never saw them again. Elsa, which was Esther's nickname, and Barney were murdered shortly after their arrival in the gas chambers. Leon never had the chance to say goodbye. Barney never had the chance to grow up and live a life of his own, and Elsa would never see her family again. Leon did not know of the fate of his wife and child. He heard of people being gassed, but did not want to imagine that had happened to his family. He said, "But that did not happen to my wife and child. I did not want to believe it. It kept me alive. Somehow my wife and child was working. I see her in the end and we can talk to one another." Leon became a slave laborer and worked at some point as a barber in the camp and sang to the capos. That's what the prisoner functionaries were called. Through his work, he earned himself extra rations, such as some additional soup. In September, he then was transferred to Monowitz, also known as Auschwitz III, which was built on behest of the company IG Farben. During his times in the camp, the Nazis did several medical experiments with him as well. In January 1945, the camp was evacuated and the inmates of Auschwitz III were sent on a 90-kilometer-long death march to Gleiwitz. His journey of horror did not end here. From Gleiwitz, he was taken to Buchenwald, which was liberated by the US Army on the 11th of April 1945. His wish was to return to Rotterdam, but first he stayed some time in Erfurt, in a city in the east of Germany, and then took a plane to Paris, where he stayed in a place with other ex-prisoners. Due to an infection of his toe, he went to the British hospital in Paris, where he then was admitted to. That picture was taken after the liberation, while Leon was in hospital wearing his uniform. Leon Greenman never got over the stroke of fate, which deprived him of his child and wife. He never remarried or became a father again. Many survivors felt survivor guilt, asking themselves why they have survived whilst others had to die. On the train in which Leon was deported to Auschwitz were 700 people, and just 2 survived, including Leon himself. Survivors mostly felt and maybe still feel the burden of their experiences throughout their whole life. Psychological assistance was not the same as it is today, and the understanding for psychological trauma was hardly pronounced as well. The priorities for many was to rebuild a life and move on. Many survivors never talked about their experiences. Some started when they were older and were able to confront the demons of their past, and some started to share relatively early. Many suffered, and perhaps still do, from post-traumatic stress disorder. Affected persons feel anxious for years after the trauma, re-experience the event in nightmares or flashbacks, have panic attacks, sleep disturbances, etc. Leon suffered from depression after the liberation and after he had learned of his family's fate. Depression is different from feeling down or sad. It is when someone feels intense emotions of anxiety, hopelessness, negativity, and helplessness, which won't go away. If you feel like you can identify yourself with those descriptions, please seek medical advice. Although the first generation will not be with us forever, the traumas of their experiences continue to be felt. Not in the exact same way, but children and grandchildren inherited part of the trauma, whether the first generation talked about their experiences or not. In that case, we talk about a second generation trauma or even a third generation trauma. Leon's model is art as a response to trauma. Writing or talking about a trauma are the most common forms of expression, but drawing, painting, or creating things are equally valid. Terry Sullivan published an article called How I Used Art to Get Through Trauma in the New York Times in 2018, in which she says, "Perhaps I was using the canvas to visually piece together fragments of personal memories, emotions, and fears during this time. Yes, it's a disjointed composition that still disturbs me today, but it may accurately reflect the feeling I had at that time." Leon Greenman may have the same feeling towards this ceramic model. In 2014, the London Jewish Cultural Centre in Golders Green hosted an exhibition called Out of the Darkness, an exhibition by Holocaust survivors, where the art made by several survivors was shown. Among others were also pictures by Leon, which the exhibitors borrowed from the Jewish Museum. His paintings entailed the things he had seen in the camps. Leon was not a professional artist. Nonetheless, art helped him sort of digest his feelings and experiences. After Leon made it to Rotterdam, he returned to London. He worked as a salesman for about 40 years and sang under the stage name Leon Murray. He dedicated his life to public Holocaust education and the fight against fascism. That picture shows him giving a speech at an anti-Nazi League demo in London in 1994. Leon died in 2008, but his story continues to be told. He left many of his objects to the Jewish Museum, which tells his story through a permanent exhibition, and work hard to continue his legacy. Thanks a lot for attending this week's object talk. Now I'm handing back over to Emma.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Mona, for sharing such a powerful object talk. At the Jewish Museum London, we are so grateful to Leon Greenman for donating such a large collection of objects to our museum and for being so dedicated to speaking here during his lifetime. We are honoured to be able to continue to tell his story and continue his legacy. Thank you so much to everybody for joining us for this week's talk and for choosing to mark Holocaust Memorial Day with the Jewish Museum London. Do join us again next week for the first of our February object talks. We will see you there.